Hey, everybody, it's Bax. Today's podcast is brought to you by Canna Provisions. Canna Provisions is an adult use cannabis dispensary with the largest selection of cannabis products in Western Massachusetts, with locations in both Holyoke and in Lee. They offer a warm, unique shopping experience with guides rather than bud tenders. In fact, they're not just a dispensary, they're a destination. Visit cannaprovisions.com. That's cannaprovisions.com. Adults 21, please, and please consume responsibly. And now, today's episode of Baxy's Musical Podcast.
What is it?
It's Baxy's Musical Podcast.
A while back, I interviewed my Marquette University classmate and friend Cheryl Pavelski from Omnivore Recordings. Cheryl, as you may recall, has had an exceptional career, winning a couple of Grammy Awards over the last decade. But she is hardly the only music success story to come out of Marquette in the 1980s, not by a long shot, because the other big success story is the amazing career of music executive John Rubeli. What you're about to hear is an incredible story of a young man from Arizona whose passion, persistence, and perception has led him from being a college freshman at Marquette University's radio station when I was there to becoming one of the founding members of the Lollapalooza Festival, one of the most influential music festivals of the 1990s, to booking, managing, and signing some of the most influential bands in history, including during his 12 years at Atlantic Records, to owning his own record label, Gray Market Records. John Rubeli is a man who has landed himself in the middle of some of the most important moments in music history and has had a hand in exposing an entire generation to some of the most important music over the last 3 decades. I've known John Rubeli for the last 35 years, and it was a pleasure to catch up with him on today's episode of Baxy's Musical Podcast. Good to see you.
You too, man.
Yeah, we caught up a little bit earlier this week, and it was great to catch up because obviously we hadn't talked in an awful long time, and I'm preparing some ideas after our conversation. And I was trying to remember back when I first met you, and you were a freshman at school, and I remember it like very distinctly because you were a guy who was like very passionate about certain bands and certain songs that were either being played on the campus radio station or not being played at the campus radio station. As I told you the other day, I had come from such a limited musical, background, where the Cars were considered a punk band, and Tom Petty was totally new wave, and I really envied the knowledge and exposure that you had. And even though there was 2 years difference, I was like 2 years ahead of you. I always felt like I was in some ways like 10 years behind you. And I'm really proud of what you've done for the last 35 years because that passion and enthusiasm has really defined your whole career.
There's an upside to not having friends. You find them in unlikely places, in record sleeves and gallery walls and whatnot. It's like the inanimate things can be healthy things.
I don't think I was any different. I think, I was buying records at the time because of of people like you and some other friends of ours. I watched what you guys were listening to and what you were buying and reflecting, and I'm going, well, I want to hear that too. And that kind of opened up the door for me to discover all this stuff. And I'm still doing it, where I'm still going back and discovering stuff that I had forgotten about, or even stuff that I'm learning about. Where does that passion for music come from?
I think it was, again, having a lot of time to myself and being kind of introspective and wanting to have a connection to something. So for me growing up, the connection was Calvin and Hobbes and the comic book strips, Mad Magazine, things that were a little bit outsider that like I could read, consider, or look at and think, I'm one of the only few people that are doing this, and I'm okay in this place. And then driving around in high school, having a cassette player, I used to think like I'm the only person right now listening to, the Bruises album by Gene Loves Jezebel. And, I'm listening to the Misfits and just me. And so in a lot of ways, I didn't choose to be insular and outside. It's just where my comfort was, trying to figure out like what life was going to unfold into for me. And I think in many ways, choosing Milwaukee and choosing Marquette was an extension of that. Like having gone to a Jesuit high school and sort of like the closest equivalent to a punk rock priest, I guess, is a Jesuit. So to be able to go in that environment and go to Milwaukee, a great city adjacent to an even, well, I'll say it, greater city, Chicago.
There's going to be people beating down their door after hearing that
I
comment.
know, I know. Well, to me, it's one and the same. How about that?
There you go.
But it just became that safe space of like, I know this, I'm familiar with this, but I can also kind of coexist in my head and coexist in the ephemera that was around me, because at that point the books and the comics gave way to records and skateboarding. And so to be in Milwaukee on my skateboard going to East Side Records, Atomic Records, and
Mhm.
places like that was like, it was the same, and then the people I met, right, people like you and people at the radio station and the handful of friends that I had, it was easy because we all looked the same, and we all kind of, which is to say, like, you could just tell, right? I'm not saying like, it's not like this was before Hot Topic, so you couldn't buy something to make you look different. And it wasn't to say that everyone was exceptionally different looking. It was just people were wearing themselves in a way that you could see, and that it invited you to have a conversation or invited you to have an engagement with them, because you're like, oh, I know that, or I know what that is. And like, I and growing up in Phoenix, seeing all of these bands from Los Angeles do their tour, which was to Phoenix, everyone from Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses to Bad Religion and Social Distortion to, the UK subs. Like, it was just, the Arizona was you had to stop somewhere between Dallas and Los Angeles. So Phoenix was like a great place for me to meet all these people and understand that it wasn't, because at that time, sure, people could dress a little differently, wear their hair a little differently, but I just responded, I think, to authenticity and uniqueness, which wasn't necessarily adorned in this ostentatious, obvious way. When you saw it, you knew it and you gravitated towards it. And so, Milwaukee, Phoenix, Los Angeles, it was all the same to me.
Yeah.
I saw the same people, I met the same people, and felt the same degree of acceptance among these people.
What's interesting is, on one hand, being a fan of music and being a fan of you mentioned, you're the only guy maybe listening to Gene Loves Jezebel. We all have bands that feel like we own that no one else knows, and there are bands, and it's ours to keep and hold close. But on the other hand, it's kind of an interesting parallel that there's a tribal part of it. And whether it's, live performance, you're with like-minded people, you're all seeing a band that together you all enjoy. And live music was clearly a very, very important thing for you. And, it was for a lot of us, but, again, many of us were not exposed to that. I mean, I grew up in a town of, at the time it was like 8,000 people. We didn't have, street lights, sidewalks, or a McDonald's. In the 80s, when we were in school together, that's when I started to discover it. And you were a real big part of that, because you were not just part of the crowd, you were part of booking the shows, which is a pretty interesting leap for many people to even dream of doing that or even know how to do that at the college level.
I mean, that was the beginnings of becoming a professional fan. That just became the journey of like, how do I take this feeling, this insight, and this sense of tribal community and share it, right? Like, everything to me is a mixtape. Everything is, if it's that great and that awesome, you want to copy it and give it to someone. You want to share it. You want to bring people to the thing that is inspiring you to feel what you feel. I mean, for me, like being in a club or a concert hall, it's like I'm together with these people, but I'm by myself, right? So I'm usually toward the front, usually lip syncing along with the act, and just in my own state of connectivity with what's going on, but I'm with people. So it was kind of like a weird sense of I'm trying by being at the concerts, and a weird sense of I'm succeeding by being at the concerts. So anyway, the thing with Marquette that was amazing was I get to Milwaukee, I immediately apply to become a DJ, which was amazing. I think my shift was like 10 p.m. on a Sunday. It was like, or 8 a.m. on a Sunday. It was one or the other. I can't remember, which was fine. And then the two guys I got hooked up with, all they played was the Grateful Dead and reggae music. And I haven't really shared this, but one of the acts that they played was this artist Muda Baruka, who was like a kind of like the reggae minor threat. Like he was just basically political, took a point of view, and was like hyper charged. And I ended up booking him on Lollapalooza in 1993. So whoever those two dudes were, I don't remember, but they
Right.
were instrumental in Muda Baruka playing, opening for Mercury Rev on Lollapalooza, and Royal Trucks, which was kind of amazing. But anyway, so I did the radio thing, and then I ended up working for a local promoter named Tony Seelig. He was the nephew of Bud Selig, who owned the Brewers at the time and was the commissioner of baseball. And Tony was this local impresario and had like the dance night twice a week, and
Hmm.
Bobby Brabant was the DJ, and you should talk to a
I've
whole.
I've thought about talking to Bobby because I don't know if you remember this. Well, there are two great stories about Bobby. One, we were having the campus radio station was having a party at this club, and I was supposed to go up and talk to the DJ about what we were going to do, and Bobby was the DJ, and
I know how that talk went.
it didn't go well. I believe it was like, "Hi, I'm Mike Baxendale from WMUR at Marquette," and I believe the response was, "Why the fuck are you up here?"
Yeah,
And
exactly.
but the other story about Bobby was when I was doing my first morning show in Milwaukee, Bobby would hang out with us all the time, me and downstairs Dan Hansen, to a point where you could almost say he was kind of like our producer on that show. I mean, he's a remarkably colorful personality, and if there's anyone that needs to write a book, it's Bobby.
Well, it's just a quick aside. Hopefully, not one too many of those, but like I used to take the bus to high school. My parents would drop me off at the mall, and I took the bus to downtown Phoenix, and then after school I'd get dropped off at the mall, and I'd go hang out at the record store.
Yep.
And the record store clerk was in the local punk rock band, and he's the one that actually introduced me to the Fall and
Mm.
Love and Rockets and things like that. And he was probably, I could say, 5 or 6 years older than me. And then one of his bandmates would hang around too and gave me Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice back in 1986 or something. And so those guys really included me in their sort of circle of the obscure, right? And Bobby was the same. And I would say, Rich Menning, who owned Atomic Records in Milwaukee, was the same. I just was, we talked about Dave Breen earlier, who was the clerk at Atomic Records. Like all these people were very giving and very supportive and very nurturing of someone that was curious like me to know the things I didn't know. And so whether it was passing down old t-shirts, or teaching me how to use oatmeal soap to spike my hair, or just what, even politics, right? It was just another side of life that there's no way I would have learned if it weren't for these older people not only accepting but really nurturing my curiosity and my need to fit in somewhere. And so anyway, at Marquette, it was really through working for Tony Seelig at the venue, talking to these booking agents about all the acts they were trying to book at the time. And Milwaukee was a great market because it was so close to Madison, so close to Green Bay, so close to Chicago. And eventually I was talking to an agent who was frustrated he couldn't book a band called the Goo Goo Dolls. And did I have any ideas? And I said, well, yeah, starting to take over this concert program on campus in the basement of the student union, and I could have them play. And he's like, do you have a budget? I'm like, I probably can get like $500. He's like, done, sold. And the Goo Goo Dolls were on a label called Metal Blade at the time. They reminded me so much of the Replacements. And I mean, I don't think you could be our age and not have one degree of separation of the greatness of the Replacements and Husker Du, and and all things Touch and Go and things like that. It was just the time. Anyway, so I ended up booking the Goo Goo Dolls, and it was awesome. And I started to think about, like, well, who am I booking this for? And then I realized, well, there's a handful of students that I know that are into it, but there's also people I was meeting around town at the venues and clubs and whatnot. And I was like, well, why don't I invite them too? Why don't I include the local music writer, Thor Christensen at the Milwaukee Journal, or the writer at the weekly alternative, the Shepherd Express? Why not include them in this and create something where, the elite private Catholic school is actually a part of your community and not outside of your community? Every Friday at 3, we had these free concerts, and the Goo Goo Dolls led to Soul Asylum, led to the Flaming Lips, led to Nine Inch Nails, led to Primus, and the list goes on. And I was at the right place at the right time, because this is sort of the apex of college rock and the height of touring, and being a venue in Milwaukee where you could play at 3 in the afternoon and get paid probably twice what you were getting paid at a club, and you were selling merch, and it was a free show, and it was in front of hundreds of people, and that night you could go play Chicago,
Right.
Madison, Green Bay. It just became something that built on itself, and I just happened to have a good Rolodex at the time.
I remember going to a lot of those shows, and I remember, the posters that were put up, and I remember people saying, "You're not gonna believe who Rubeli booked." And it was years later when the Goo Goo Dolls are blowing up commercially, and Soul Asylum, and then and many of the bands that you're talking about really hit. It's like, "Hey, wait a minute, I saw those in a room full of 150 people, and it was awesome."
Well, I have to say, part of it was having the administration of the school really emphasize the student activity fee that we all paid, and really having, I mean, I think what Jerry Seinfeld performed my senior year on campus. So you had people booking speakers. I think Jello Biafra spoke to, so it was a time where Milwaukee was right on the map in terms of all of these people doing these tours, whether it was a spoken word tour or a comedy tour, and in my case, music tours. And so, I just remember I really wanted to book Peter Murphy, because I think all of us were Bauhaus fans at the time. And Peter Murphy had this album Deep that was coming out, and which ended up being his big album. And Cut You Up is still a song that gets played a lot on alternative radio. And they played in the movie theater on campus. And I charged $3 for students and $7 for the general public. And tickets remained available up until a week before. And then what happened was I started getting flack because it ended up selling out. People were confused why tickets were made available to the general public, but that was helping to offset the budget of putting on the show. But the reason why it picked up is the opening act was Nine Inch Nails, and it was right before Pretty Hate Machine came out. And right around the time the show happened, which was in April of 1990, Nine Inch Nails was it. And they just happened to be lucky. Again, I think, like in life, if you put yourself out there in a way where you have good intention and you have this degree of authenticity, I don't know, you tend to be in the right place more often than not. And I just feel like, for me, people like you and the other friends I had on campus made me feel okay. I'm sorry, I'm using very contemporary speak. I wish I knew what that meant back then. I wish I knew what therapy was, because I didn't have the same parents you did. To me, music was the most therapeutic thing, unbeknownst to myself. was curing things I didn't know was a problem, and ultimately putting me on a healthier path than I guess I otherwise would have been on. But the overall experience I had in Milwaukee for 4 years changed my life and influenced everything I've done since.
Let's talk about after Marquette. Tell me about what happened immediately after. Did you go right back home to Arizona, or did you stick around that area?
Yeah, it was pretty fortuitous. I packed up my Volkswagen and I saw Madonna on the like a prayer tour at the Rosemont Horizon in Chicago with my stuff in the parking lot and continued driving home. I was home for about a month in Scottsdale, and my dad was in pretty insistent that I go to business school, and I was pretty insistent that I not go to business school. And then after about a month, it was July 4th weekend. I moved to Los Angeles, and I had some friends in a band that had a room for rent for $100 a month. And I had had this experience at this point in the music industry. And I just thought, why not give it a shot? The other thing I had done in college was I was a college rep for Capitol Records, which gave me a really good insight and relationship with record companies and just the way that the business as a whole was working. And I thought, well, why not? Let me give it a shot. So I get to Los Angeles, and I started interning at a couple of labels, one of which my roommates were on. They were on a label called IRS Records. They got dropped, and I quit immediately, and then interned at another label. And at the same time, I got a job at a record store called Moby Disc. There was a chain of them in the Southern California area, and they were one of the first to be a new used record store. And it was right at the time CDs were becoming ubiquitous, so everyone was trading in their vinyl. So I was at this really amazing store, and there was really it was a really colorful location in the San Fernando Valley, and people like Burt Reynolds and Sherman Hemsley, cast of the Brady Bunch would come in, and like I met a guy named Ed Stasium who actually produced Soul Asylum and
Yep.
Living Color and the Ramones, and Ed became a friend. And I just was one of those record store clerks where I was so enthusiastic. I wanted to share great stuff with people. And one day this guy came in and was buying really amazing stuff, and I was sharing with him, and he sort of Bobby Brabanted me and was like, get away kind of thing. Like I already know all of this. And anyway, I was persistent, and he pays with a gift certificate, and it has the name Mark Geiger on there. And Mark is a legendary alternative booking agent who was one of the people that started Lollapalooza. Um, we'll get to that in a second. And I just said, and he was an agent I had dealt with when I was in college. And I just said, dude, like, I'm so incredibly honored to meet you. And he's like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I moved out here. I want a job. He's like, well, come in tomorrow. We'll interview you for the agent training program. And the agency was called Triad, which William Morris ended up buying.
Hmm.
So I found myself in the classic David Geffen mailroom, working my way up from delivering packages and copying scripts to sitting on a desk. And the end goal there was to be a booking agent. And the agency I worked at booked Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, eventually started Lollapalooza, which we'll get to meet, and that. Booked a lot of the 4AD and creation bands that I really liked. And I was literally in the hub of everything that meant something to me. And so I sat at that desk, and people walked by, and I wanted to know who every single person was. So you had musicians and managers and lawyers and record label people. And I just needed to know who they all were, and sort of just assumed a position as a wallflower or a cubicle, something or other, and just stared at these people. And eventually I started to develop friendships and relationships. I mean, my favorite story is the agency booked the Inspiral Carpets, and they had this really sort of boisterous roadie with them, and it ended up being Noel Gallagher from Oasis. And I was like, oh, okay. So got to meet him, and then I ended up taking Perry Farrell to see Oasis at the Whiskey in LA for their first ever show. But anyway, speaking of Perry, I ended up meeting his manager at the time, a guy named Ted Gardner.
Hmm.
He was managing Jane's Addiction and Tool. He's kind of a legendary, brash Australian guy who got his start tour managing Men at Work, Frank Zappa, Echo and the Bunnymen, and was known as being a very colorful, very decisive, some would say threatening personality. But he took a real interest in me and saw my enthusiasm, saw my passion, and took it as something genuine. I mentioned this to you earlier. Like, I'm not a cynical person. I'm just purely, I'm emotive, I'm passionate, I find joy in things. Some people may say that I'm full of the S word, but that's just me. And he saw that in me and said, you know, you could really be doing more than what you're doing here. So why don't you come help grow my management company? And Perry and I are talking, and we want to give you a stage to book on Lollapalooza where you can take all of your passion and all of your interests, and we'll let you pick bands and make it your thing. And that was in 1992. So I was 24, and I thought of it in the same way I thought of booking shows at Marquette. It was, instead of picking things for, you know, the few hundred people that would come to the lunchroom, I started thinking about the tens of thousands of people that would come to these empty fields that we would show up at, and amphitheaters. And so it's the same thing. It was
Yeah.
the same, it was the same mixtape sharing ideology that I had developed up until that point.
What's really interesting about your involvement in Lollapalooza is if you look at the bookings for the 3 years that you were there, the bands that were being booked on the secondary stage, you know, in hindsight, were every bit as impressive as those who were on the main stage. In fact, in some cases, they became bigger bands. Credit to you that that secondary stage became such a popular feature of that entire festival.
Thanks, man. Because you're like the first famous person I ever knew. So coming from you, that means a lot.
Well,
Um,
let's keep that let's keep that clear headed
Dude,
and
I'm telling you,
realistic.
I saw you walking down Wisconsin Avenue, and I'm like, that dude's on the radio, and I know him. That's a magic moment. It was around, I don't know, 14th Street or something.
Yep.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so so but I can tell you, you know, there's a thread that's coming together here, and that is when I showed up to an empty office, literally with the desk and a chair and a phone, not knowing what I was going to do to go ahead and officially book the 1993 Lollapalooza. I had made some suggestions and sort of loosely helped out a little bit with the 92 Lollapalooza. But in 93 was, we're going to have an official second stage, we're going to advertise it, and we're going to make it a real thing. So I wasn't really sure, you know, what to do. And I sat down and I ended up the first band I ever booked was a band called Cell. Cell was on DGC. They were signed by Sonic Youth at the same time they signed Nirvana. And they were managed by a guy named Lyle Heisen, who was in a band called Das Damen. And I saw Das Damen play at the Unicorn in Milwaukee. And Lyle was in New York. I think he was working for Matador Records at the time.
Mhm.
Anyway, Lyle knew everybody. So I kind of explained, like, this is something I'm trying to do. And at that point, Lollapalooza had this tinge of like a corporate rock festival. So I was trying to convince people that they wouldn't lose credibility by doing Lollapalooza, you know, because that was a big thing. Like, you're a sellout, you lose cred, all of that stuff that when you're a part of a subculture, you know, you contend with. Anyway, so Lyle started sharing his Rolodex, introducing me to people. I met these two gals who ran a label called Simple Machines, Jenny and Kristen, and they were putting out amazing records at the time. They'd actually released a book on how to release your own records and how to tour, and they were friends with a lot of the Discord bands and a lot of the teen bands, and so they put me in touch with the band Unrest. And so I ended up booking them, and then I met Sebado's agent, and so she was amazing, and so it started spiraling. And then one day, out of the blue, I got a message from Steve Shelley, the drummer of Sonic Youth, and at that point, Sonic Youth's Sister was my every Beatles album combined into one. That
Right.
was it for me. And he had gotten my number from Lyle and said, "Hey, I want to play the festival. I have a side project called Mosquito." And it was with Jad Fair from Half Japanese,
Hmm.
and a guy named Tim Folion from $2 Guitar. And they were actually Cat Power's band at the time. So Steve was putting out Cat Power's records. And so it was like, in the thick of like really solid core indie rock at the time. And this is like the drummer of my favorite band asking if he could play. And I was like, sure. And then the next week, I got a call from Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth, who said she wanted to play because she had a side project called Free Kitten with Julie K. Fritz from Pussy Galore, which was one of my absolute favorite bands at the time, and Mark Eibald from Pavement. I was like, okay, sure. And then the week after that, Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth called and said, hey, my wife's going on tour. Can I tag along? I'm working on a solo record, and can I play some shows? So here I have like 3/4 of my favorite band ever calling this 24-year-old kid saying we want to play your festival. And then I got to hang out with them for part of the summer. That was the other bonus for me, is not only could I pick these bands, I could go hang out with all of these people. And it was truly like the lifelong summer camp relationships that you develop because of how close knit it was all then. And again, this was pre-internet, pre-everything. This was hand to mouth, passing Flipside and Maximum rock and roll magazines from one to the next. And it was truly the subculture. So the other thing that I benefited from that summer, aside from hanging out with all these amazing people, was I got to meet kids in every single city that the festival toured to, and understood what made people the same, what made people different. And so I spent the next 2 years, 94 and 95, really thinking about all of those kids and book the things that I thought they would like, whether they knew they existed or not, which led to Stereolab, which led to the Verve, which led to the Roots, which led to Method Man, which led to Coolio. So I have a really funny Coolio story.
Okay.
So I really wanted to book Coolio in 1995. I love that Fantastic Voyage song with the Ride Ride Slippity Slide chorus. And he was just a character. And at that point, I had I had booked the Fushnikins because I Mike D and the BC Boys played in 1994, and Mike D was really hands-on and who played the second stage and was the most respectful, most encouraging, and most gracious partner one could ask for in selecting acts, and really helped me recognize the need to program specifically to the people that were coming. And so I don't know, Coolio fit the bill to me, and I didn't have enough in my budget to book him in 1995. And I went to Ted Gardner and said, I really want to book Coolio. I don't have enough money. The other members of the committee are not having my back. He's like, just do it and we'll find you the money. So
Wow.
that year, Sonic Youth headlined. And I thought it was a little troubling for me because I felt like the main stage became almost too insular. It became too, I guess, inside baseball, right? Like, and I found myself arguing for Stone Temple Pilots, for Live, for Bush, for like more the Goo Dolls, more commercial alternative acts that would actually bring in the person that didn't have the level of exposure that the rest of us had, because those are the things that sell tickets. Those are the things that bring people in. And my philosophy was always, people are going to come to Lollapalooza regardless, at least at that point. It's kind of like what Coachella is now. But Lollapalooza was that until I think 95 made it not that, because it was too obscure on the main stage and didn't have enough acknowledgement of what people were actually listening to in order to then get them to listen to the stuff that we were programming that was maybe a little outside of what their level of exposure was. So going back to Coolio, I remember he rolls up to the World Amphitheater in Chicago, and the second stage was in the parking lot. The other bands were Laika, Roller Skate Skinny, and Yola Tango. And it was, and Coolio. And so he shows up, and nice guy. I give him a Polaroid camera and said, hey, can you take a picture of your entourage? I need to make you laminates. And an hour goes by, and I'm like, hey man, can I have the pictures? He's like, oh, I need more film. So I give him more film. Hour later, like, hey man, because I just need like 2 more rolls of film and I got you. I'm like, all right. So I look for him again, and I walk by the merch booth, and there's like 50 Coolio signed Polaroids for sale for like $50 each. And I was like, this is amazing. Anyway, Coolio performs that day. He's in the parking lot, and the Jesus Lizard is on the main stage.
Okay.
The Jesus Lizard is playing to a few hundred people, and Coolio is playing to 18,000 people in the parking lot, because at the beginning of the summer, the song Gangster's Paradise was released, and it was like one of the hits of the summer. Again,
Right.
just total luck. And I remember the first time he played it, it was before it was even on the radio. I was like, you sure you want to play that song? Because it wasn't anything at that point, and it was a lot different stuff that he'd done. But one of the organizers came up to me and was super aggressive and was like, you effed me. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You deliberately did this to upstage me having the Jesus Lizard on the main stage, and you just had to rub it in, didn't you? And I'm like, no, I that's not a motivation of mine. But what I'd like you to pay attention to is the fact that you had absolutely no idea that 18,000 people would like to see this. And I
Hmm.
caught a lot of flack from you because you didn't have the same insight I did for the previous 2 summers to know that that was something that was going to work and was something that was going to be successful. So, again, not to, I mean, I know everything sounds all chipper and rosy, but it was difficult. I mean, it was difficult being a 24-year-old kid in a room with people almost twice my age defending the subculture. Like in 1993, saying you have to book Dinosaur Jr. on the main stage because you don't have anyone else representing the community of musicians that I'm booking on the second stage. And there should be some continuity between the two stages. And so I stuck my neck out in a way that made me very uncomfortable, probably very unhealthy, because I'm super sensitive, super passionate. I didn't understand why they were coming for me. But at the same time, I also didn't know that I was coming across super confident with blinders on, and in their eyes was probably just this punk ass kid pushing their way through, when in fact all I was simply a kid
Yeah.
and doing what kids do.
Well, and what you were doing was booking acts that it's not under your control whether or not they succeed, and it's not under your control when they succeed. Or, and Coolio's an interesting example because, I mean, you're absolutely right. He takes a he takes a Stevie Wonder song and makes it a huge hit. Who would have known that that would have happened? And that's not your fault. And it's interesting that someone would take it as you aggressively stepping on feet. You're just doing the job that you were being hired to do. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
and I'll rewind to 1994, which I feel like was kind of the peak in my mind of Lollapalooza. That was the year that the Beastie Boys and the Smashing Pumpkins headlined, and it was the year that Nirvana was supposed to play. And there was a big back and forth about Nirvana playing, and at one point Nirvana's agent asked me to talk to Kurt about the bands that he wanted to have play. And both he and Billy Corgan really wanted Shudder to Think to play, so I loved the Discord connection and was happy to have them play. And Kurt mentioned the Frogs, who happened to be from Milwaukee, and I thought it was a weird, crazy full circle for me that he would mention the Frogs. But as we all know, Nirvana ended up not doing it. The Frogs end up doing it, and like they showed up, and I mean, one of the brothers performed in blackface. I mean, no one thought anything of it at the time, and because they had let's just say they did like a pro gay album, they did a pro black album, and they're two esoteric brothers from Milwaukee who just wrote some of the most amazing Daniel Johnston, Alex Chilton-esque songs,
Hmm.
and were just like sublime in every way.
Yeah.
So they show up, and a guy named Damian Striggins was playing bass, and he was the the bouncer at a club in Milwaukee called the Unicorn. And it just was so crazy that he was there. Rich, who owned Atomic Records, came along and filmed the whole thing. It was crazy that he was there. And like Billy Corgan would drop on the second stage and perform with them. And pretty soon that summer, a lot of the main stage acts were taking an interest in the second stage. So Green Day played unannounced, L7 played unannounced, and Cypress Hill played unannounced, the Black Crowes played unannounced. Like I had all of these things that were going on because a lot of the main stage acts were recognizing the connection to the subculture that was happening on the second stage. Like Nick
Right.
Cave would sing "What a Wonderful World" with the Flaming Lips. And the Flaming Lips was its own story. I think I mentioned to you, I booked them at Marquette, and
Yep.
um, the opening act was Nirvana, who was supposed to play. But I got a call from Chris Novoselic at 2, who said, "We're leaving now. We'll be there soon." And I said, "Where are you leaving from?" And he said, "Minneapolis." And I'm like, "Dude, you're several hours away. You're not going to miss our show." Um, but that was my initial connection with Nirvana. I ended up seeing them the next night at the Cabaret Metro in Chicago. But anyway, so the Flaming Lips I became friendly with back then, and I just sort of stayed in touch and ended up helping bring them into the agency I was working at, who started representing them. And I went with them to the taping of 90210 when they performed at the Peach Pit. So again, I was living this amazing life as a professional fan.
Yeah.
People I met. Anyway, during that summer tour, they had that song "She Don't Use Jelly" that became a hit that summer. And I just remember telling people from Warner Brothers that were coming out, like, "You're not paying any attention to the Flaming Lips." And I'm telling you, every time they play this song, the place goes absolutely nuts. Like, you should pay attention to this band. And so again, I'm finding myself in a position where I'm on the front line seeing the kids react to the thing that they're being exposed to, having to advocate for and ultimately defend what that is to the industry people, who again are looking at me like I'm, some punk kid. And in reality, I'm like, I'm a window into the thing that you're all programming for. I'm the person you are doing this to, for, and because of. And if I'm reminding you of that, it's only from the place of, I feel like that's why I'm here. And I feel like that's why Perry Farrell put me in this position. It's because he recognized those things in me, and frankly got out of the way and supported everything I did to allow me to be turned loose in a way in this environment. And like someone said to me, like, if, who would you book on Lollapalooza now? And I said, I wouldn't. I'd let a kid do it. Although I would do a 25th or anniversary restaging of the second stage. But that's the thing. I think that's why these festivals have become so successful. Like I'm such a big fan of Paul Tillett, who runs Golden Voice, who started Coachella, who surrounds himself with the best taste making people possible and remains relevant year after year. That's the thing that Lollapalooza stopped doing.
Yeah.
And it stopped acknowledging its own fallibility and its own lack of relevancy.
I think whenever you have something that achieves a level of success, and I assume that Lollapalooza is probably a lot like this. I mean, at some point, the business of being Lollapalooza becomes a little bit more important than the actual festival itself. And and when you get certain people involved, like I've been interviewing enough bands and musicians over the years to know that a lot of times those in the record industry don't necessarily know a whole hell of a lot about music. They know about distributing records, they know about sales, they know about business and everything else, but they don't always have the ear that lets them say, "Well, this band has, great potential." They're kind of hearing that from younger people, but they don't really see it themselves. And sometimes that's why certain bands miss the mark or certain bands don't get the attention that they probably deserve. As a guy that wound up transitioning into A&R, did you find the same kind of resistance to certain ideas and certain discoveries that you had, or was it working
No,
for them?
it was 100% a place filled with people that were not music fans.
Hmm.
And I don't understand that. And maybe being, a Hall of Fame broadcaster. You know, you probably don't encounter too many peers that are huge music fans like yourself. And again, this isn't an indictment of the other people. It's like some people are great at their job and their other things, but being a music fan and being in a position to choose and identify talent and apply resources to it at the level a major label does, and put everything I have towards that, was kind of like the next logical step for me.
Right.
And in my head, I just wanted A&R not to stand for acquire and ruin, because that's what it seemed like was happening to a lot of the, you know, the Indian alternative bands that were getting signed around the time I started at Atlantic, which was in 1995. So for me, the going into it, I just kept thinking about the people in the grill room at Marquette, the audiences at Lollapalooza, the kids that I hung out with in the mall in high school. Like who are those people now? Like if I was 14 in 1995 and I woke up that day, what would be my thing? What would be my favorite thing?
Right.
And so I set out signing acts appealing to that, versus my own strident sense of music being about My Bloody Valentine and Sonic Youth. Like I knew you know, and at that time I'm approaching 30, and I'm like, okay, so people aren't necessarily gonna have the same experience that I do and respond to the same things that I do. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the same sense of curiosity and passion and degree of interest that I did. So in many ways, I had to put whatever the quote unquote cool was aside and really just think about what could impact someone that was a 14-year-old version of myself that day. And so at Atlantic, that's what I set out to do. And ironically, like I ended up A&Ring 2 Bad Religion records. And that was a band I used to go see in high school. And I have such tremendous respect for them. And their guitar player, Brian Baker, was in Minor Threat.
Yep.
He was in Dak Nasty. He was in Junkyard. To this day, one of the smartest, funniest people I've ever met. The other guitar player was in the Circle Jerks and was in Red Cross. So here I am offering advice and opinions to people that I considered heroes and legendary. And, you know, Greg Graffin, the singer at the time, was getting his PhD in paleontology from Cornell. And, you know, I'm not worthy, right? But they were so accepting and so supportive of having the voice in the room, and ultimately enlisting me as a problem solver and utilizing all that I'd done to kind of help in any way that I could. So that was a real big moment for me to be in that position. One of my other favorite projects, I A&R'd a gal named Poe, P-O-E, who was basically had recorded the first ever album on Pro Tools. The album went gold, and had a very fierce thread that just needed someone to keep everyone away and enable her to do her thing. And so I ended up A&Ring her second album that took about 2 years to put together. Her brother, Mark Danielewski, had released an album called The House of Leaves, which was kind of like in the pantheon of David Foster Wallace and Jeffrey Eugenides and things like that, where it was a writer's writer and an instant cult hero book. So I was in a position where I had to defend her and her art and what she was doing. And that really fortified a lot for me. And it was at that time that I found the band POD. And at first it was, I wasn't really sure what I was listening to, because it was a hybrid of so many things. And I had gone to a show at the Roxy on Sunset on a Sunday night. It was sold out. The kids were 14. They had better skateboard clothes than I did. They were more passionate at that point than I was. And they were just playing this really fierce music that reminded me a lot of, I don't know, maybe Rage Against the Machine, or I don't know, maybe a little bit of Tool or something. But I met the guys, and it was interesting. The bass player's like, I listen to George Benson and Quincy Jones, and the drummer's like, I learned to play drums to the Cars and AC/DC. And the singer's like, I like Bob Marley and Led Zeppelin, but the guitar player was like, I like Jimmy Eat World, I like the Chemical Brothers. I was like, oh, okay. And then they're like, but we all like Bad Brains, and I'm like, I'm in. And so and I would say I cited all their musical influences. What I was hearing in the guitar player was a lot of the same intonation that Killing Joke had in their music.
Yeah.
So there was really sort of affected, angular, emotive guitar that was coming through his fingers on the fretboard. And I was like, okay, so if I can orient myself to them through what the Bad Brains have been to me, and I can apply the sort of Britishy, gothy, new wavy stuff that I like, maybe this could be a thing. So I signed them, and the band had at that point had a following in let's call it the Christian market.
Right.
And I call it the Christian market because there was a scene of bands at the time that were playing to youth groups and social halls and church basements and things like that. And their contemporaries were a band called MXPX. And even I think Blink 182 had some ties to it at that point. But what you had was a subculture. You had these bands that were playing in these tertiary and secondary markets to suburban kids whose parents let them go to shows because their youth group and their church sponsored it. But the music sounded like contemporary punk rock music.
Funny that you mentioned, Bad Brains and even Killing Joke, and all three of those bands certainly have like a certain spirituality to them. Certainly Bad Brains, but even on the furthest end of it, Killing Joke does too.
Right. And we would say, like, there's Christians in the band, but they're not a Christian rock band, and we would cite U2 a lot. And Bono had this quote of, religion is when God leaves and man takes over. And U2 was pretty supportive of what we were doing at the time because they knew the band had this spiritual thread, let's call it that. But they never went out and preached, and they never went out and sort of smashed everything over their heads. And the crazy thing is, POD's first ever tour was opening for Primus. And that goes back to my connection booking Primus at Marquette. So many things come full circle that way. And then Korn ended up taking them on the road. And then they went on to take Linkin Park out for Linkin Park's first ever tour. They were the first act of 3. And it was just one of those things where you could just see the kids responding, the subculture responding. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, their version of rock and metal was what became a thing. And they were the first rock band to be number 1 on TRL. They got on there and they gave shout outs to Stained and the Deftones and Incubus. And Atlantic got really angry that they didn't mention the other acts on Atlantic, but there weren't other acts on Atlantic like them at the time. And I was just in my own lane with them and listening to them and facilitating them doing what they do. Because I think the smartest thing any music executive does is listen to the artist, because they know better. I can think I know better, I can act like I know better, but if they truly have it, which the right musicians and artists do, every minute you should spend listening to what it is that they have to say, and then spend your efforts trying to implement that no matter what. And it's the no matter what that sucks.
I want to ask you though a little bit because you've owned Gray Market Records for like the last 6 or 7 years, and I was on the website yesterday, actually right after we talked the other day, just to listen to these bands because I had not heard these artists, and it's interesting that you talk about what you are marketing to or what you were thinking about marketing to many years ago, because the songs that I heard from and I may be butchering the names like Donzi and Oka Tigra and some of the others that were on the website. They may be obscure names, but these are all very accessible sounding records, and they were wonderful. I mean, they were really, really good. And it's like,
Well, it's full circle,
yeah,
because to me it's now, when you end up, look, and working for Lollapalooza, working for Atlantic, running a joint venture with Atlantic and then Universal, you find yourself in a position where trends are changing, tastes are shifting, you become good at a job, and you fight that strength against your passion and your belief in something which could be entirely different. So I was orienting myself to my job through the people that were making the music. The music that they were making may not have necessarily been my first love or my first thing, but I believed in them. I believed in their vision. I believed in what they were doing. And I knew how to facilitate on their behalf opportunities and shepherding resources to them. And that was kind of what I then became good at, was learning how to turn every no into a not yet, and then the not yet into a yes, and the yes into hopefully other people falling in to their line of vision and what they were trying to do as artists. But eventually it kind of runs its course. And I think, everything is cyclical, and I don't know if the 20-year cycle makes sense or whatever, but I just found myself at the end of running a joint venture really not wanting to listen to music and not wanting to spend my spare time in the headspace of just listening. And I started going to art galleries, and art galleries became the new record stores for me, and I
Right.
just would go lost there like I would. But anyway, I just took a step back, and I realized there was so many younger artists making music that was very similar to music I was listening to 20 years ago, and referencing bands like Ride and Slow Dive and My Bloody Valentine and the Cocteau Twins, um, and of course Joy Division, New Order, Bauhaus, The Cure. My pantheons of rock. I realized at that point, like, I don't need the big infrastructure of a major label anymore. Most artists are able to record at home or with a friend. A lot of people mixing now are charging very reasonable mix rates
Right.
because they don't have to have a $2,000 a day studio. They have a home studio, and you're paying them a fraction of what you used to because their costs aren't being eaten up by the studio. So more money can go to them. So anyway, I just decided to find acts that speak to what I love and what my passion is, and hopefully provide them the same level of advice, the same level of guidance, and hopefully enough resources where it then becomes what Amit Erdogan, who founded Atlantic Records, would tell me time and time again. It's all about timing, and it's all about luck. And I feel like right now, the hardest thing for any new artist is breaking anonymity,
Yeah.
because we don't have the level of curation we used to have at radio and 120 minutes, and the one page in Rolling Stone devoted to alternative music. Like, you would have very specific tastemakers that you could point to that would open you up to the new things. Now there's so many playlists, there's so many avenues, there's so many outlets. And as a person working with new and developing talent, I can't just hire a publicist and get in Melody Maker and NME and
Right.
alternative press. That's not a thing anymore. I can't just get on the specialty radio show, present company exempted, and even college radio. What's that now?
Yeah.
And so much of what's breaking acts now is TikTok, Twitch, and Instagram. And I have to say, it's really tough, but it doesn't diminish my passion for what I'm doing. It just means I have to figure out and unpuzzle what this moment is. And I'm still trying to figure that out.
Well, you've got a major challenge in the fact that just distribution has a whole different meaning today in music. I mean, you're not moving albums or CDs anymore. You're moving MP3s and playlists. And it's very hard to really feel as if there's a monetization point in that when the payback to a Spotify is so lopsided. It's a difficult time to be a musician.
Well, the hard part is, what do I invest in and how do I invest in? And so what it usually comes back to is, the music that's being made, the equipment that's being purchased to make it, the photo shoots that are representing the artist in absence of not being able to tour for 2 years, music videos that have gotten a lot cheaper to make, and all of those things that are presenting what this project is. Because anyone can put up a digital single or album and have it available around the world in 24 hours, but 10,000 other people are doing it in that same moment. So then what? And the idea that for 2 years we haven't had the ability to connect fan to band has led to, a lot of what's been going on TikTok, and a lot of what's been going on Instagram, which I think is okay. Like my playlist last year, like I one of the top things I listened to the most was the Dua Lipa album. The Dua Lipa album is amazing. The production is great, the songwriting is great, and that's alongside Black Country New Road. So I still have the same esoteric sense of what I'm gravitating towards, but I'm also actively pursuing finding out the things I don't know. Like, one of my favorite acts is an artist named Nilüfer Yanya from the UK, and she's amazing. And I forget where I first heard of her, but like finding an artist like that few of my friends know about and sharing why I like it has been amazing.
Yeah.
But that said, I think the thing is with the label is I'm worrying more about how good the projects are, how authentic they are, and hoping that the timing will line up, and hoping that things will fall into place for them. Like, 2 of the acts on the label are playing the South by Southwest Festival in Austin. Most people I talk to aren't going because of COVID, but it's such a legendary first look for so many emerging acts that the 2 acts that I have that are performing there are really building in and around touring in and touring out and trying to get different parties and other looks while they're there. So that's a great opportunity. But ultimately, what I think is going to happen post-pandemic is a return to, coming full circle to the tribal aspect of things. Because I feel like more than anything, we're looking for our tribe again. We're looking for a version of what the subculture was to you and me. And I really think people are going to find it again. And I really think within each of the tribes and each of the subcultures, we're going to have the superstars within each of them emerge. That's going to then affect, and then ultimately, hopefully, enhance and increase the level of exposure that people have to artists other than Dua Lipa.
Hey, listen, I am thrilled that we had a chance to do this. I was looking forward to talking to you for a long time, and I'm really glad we made it happen. And I said it at the beginning, and I mean it now. I'm very proud of you, John, and your career has been astounding, and you've made a lot of Marquette people very proud of you. So thank you.
Thanks, man. I'll talk to you soon, hopefully.
Good to see you, John. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Today's podcast is brought to you by Canna Provisions in Holyoke and Lee, Massachusetts. Check them out at cannaprovisions.com. If you like the show, feel free to share it, review it, tell all your friends about it. You can reach me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think. And thanks again for listening to Baxi's Musical Podcast.